Ivan Petrov had been working at the Galactic Veterans Rehabilitation Center for 3 years, and he'd learned that every species dealt with trauma differently. The Rigelians stored painful memories in specialized neural compartments that could be temporarily suppressed. The Andromedans channeled traumatic stress through controlled crystalline fractures that created intricate patterns of light. And the Zephyrians processed battlefield trauma by allowing their gaseous forms to disperse and reconsolidate in healing environments. But Nox was different. In 18 months of regular appointments at the rehabilitation center, the battle-scarred Morvakian had never once shown any response to the advanced trauma therapies, neural recalibration treatments, or holographic memory processing that had helped hundreds of other veterans recover from their war experiences. Nox Ironwill, 0900 appointment. The receptionist announced through the center's intercom system, using the formal military designation that all Morvakian veterans preferred to their civilian names. Ivan looked up from his treatment room where he was preparing heated oils and therapeutic stones for what would be their 43rd session together. Through the observation window, he could see Nox sitting in the waiting area with the perfect military posture that never relaxed, his massive gray-scaled form taking up 2 standard chairs, while his yellow eyes stared at nothing with a 1,000-yard stare that even recognized from too many combat veterans. Nox entered the treatment room with the mechanical precision that characterized all his movements. No wasted motion, no emotional expression, no acknowledgement of comfort or discomfort. He positioned himself on the massage table with the same clinical efficiency he probably used for military medical examinations. "Good morning, Nox," Ivan said cheerfully, the same greeting he'd used for 18 months of sessions that had produced no visible improvement in Nox's condition. "How are you feeling today?" "Physical condition is operational," Nox replied in the monotone voice that Morvakian veterans used when they learned to suppress all emotional inflection. "Muscle tension in dorsal region requires maintenance. Proceed with standard therapeutic protocol." Ivan had heard this exact response 42 times before. Nox approached massage therapy the way a soldier approaches equipment maintenance necessary, routine, completely impersonal. But Ivan had learned something important about trauma recovery during his 3 years at the rehabilitation center. Sometimes the most important. Healing happened in the moments between therapy techniques, when veterans allowed themselves to be human instead of just functional. "Nox, before we start the massage, can I ask you something different today?" Nox's yellow eyes focused on Ivan with the sharp attention that combat veterans gave to any deviation from established patterns. "Specify." "Inquiry. I've been working with you for 1.5 years, and I realize I don't know anything about your life before the military service. Were you always interested in becoming a soldier?" For the first time in 43 sessions, Nox's perfect military posture shifted slightly. It was barely perceptible, a minor adjustment in shoulder position that most people wouldn't notice, but Ivan had learned to observe the subtle signs that indicated when veterans were processing unexpected questions. "Personal history is not relevant to therapeutic treatment," Nox replied, but his voice carried a micro-fluctuation that suggested the question had penetrated his emotional barriers. "You're right," Ivan agreed, beginning to apply warm oil to Nox's massive shoulders. "But I find that knowing something about who people were before their trauma helps me understand what they're trying to heal back toward." Nox was quiet for several minutes as Ivan worked on the chronic tension that had been locked in his muscles for years. The Morvakians' physiology was fascinating, dense, powerful musculature designed for their high-gravity homeworld, but capable of incredible precision when relaxed properly. "I was a sculptor," Nox said suddenly, his voice so quiet that Ivan almost missed the admission. Ivan paused in his massage technique, recognizing that Nox had just shared something he'd probably never told any of the advanced therapists or neural specialists who had worked with him. "A sculptor? That's amazing." What kind of sculptures did you create? Memorial installations. Large-scale works commemorating civilian achievements, successful harvests, technological innovations, cultural celebrations. I specialized in capturing moments of community joy and prosperity. Even continued working on Knox's shoulders, noting how the veteran's muscle tension began to ease slightly as he talked about his pre-military life. That sounds like beautiful work. Creating permanent monuments to positive experiences must have been incredibly satisfying. It was meaningful. Each installation required understanding the emotional significance of the event I was commemorating, then translating that emotional content into physical form that would inspire viewers for generations. So you were used to channeling emotions into tangible creations. Knox's posture shifted again, this time in a way that suggested he was processing connections he hadn't considered before. Yes, emotional translation was the core of my artistic practice. I believed that sculpture should make abstract feelings physically accessible to audiences. Even realized he had accidentally stumbled onto something significant. Knox's pre-war profession had required the same skills that trauma recovery demanded: understanding complex emotions and finding ways to express them safely. But his military training had taught him to suppress emotional expression entirely. Knox, can I try something different with today's massage? Instead of just working on muscle tension, what if we approached it the way you might approach sculpture, focusing on what your body is trying to express, rather than just what it needs to maintain? Knox turned his head to look at Ivan directly for the first time in 43 sessions. Explain methodology. Well, as a sculptor, you probably learned to read the natural qualities in your materials, understanding what the stone or metal wanted to become, rather than forcing it into predetermined shapes. What if we approached your physical tension the same way? You are suggesting that muscle tension contains artistic information? I'm suggesting that your body has been holding on to experiences that your mind learned not to express. Maybe instead of just relieving the tension, we could listen to what it's trying to communicate. Knox was quiet for a long time, his yellow eyes studying Ivan with the intensity that Morvakians brought to evaluating complex problems. Ivan Petrov, human masseur. That approach contradicts standard therapeutic protocols that prioritize symptom relief over emotional exploration. You're right. But standard therapeutic protocols haven't been particularly effective for you over the past 18 months. What if we tried treating your body like a work of art that needs understanding rather than just maintenance? For the first time since Ivan had known him, Knox's perfect military composure cracked slightly. Not much, just a subtle softening around his eyes that suggested he was allowing himself to consider possibilities beyond survival and functionality. Proceed with experimental methodology, Knox said. But I must warn you that I have not engaged with artistic concepts since my military service began 15 years ago. Ivan adjusted his massage technique, working more slowly and paying attention to what Knox's body was communicating rather than following standard therapeutic patterns. Instead of just relieving tension, he began to notice the stories that muscles held years of hypervigilance locked into his shoulders, reflexive protective responses embedded in his back, chronic alertness maintained through constant muscular readiness. Knox, your shoulders are holding a lot of weight. Not just physical weight, emotional weight. Like they've been braced against something for a very long time. Combat readiness requires constant preparation for threat assessment and rapid response deployment. Knox replied automatically. I understand that. But what if, just for the next hour, you didn't have to be ready for anything? What if you could let your body remember what it felt like to create something instead of just protect something? As Ivan continued working, he noticed subtle changes in Knox's breathing, small shifts in muscle tension that suggested the veteran was beginning to access physical memories that had been suppressed for years. It wasn't traumatic. Knox's military conditioning was too strong for sudden, emotional breakthrough, but it was the first sign of genuine relaxation Ivan had observed in all their sessions together. Even, Knox said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that had been completely absent from their previous interactions. I need to tell you something about why standard therapy has not been effective. I'm listening. The trauma I sustained was not just from combat experiences. It was from being forced to destroy my own artistic works during military conscription. Morvakian soldiers are required to eliminate all civilian attachments that might compromise military efficiency. Ivan felt his heart break a little as he understood what Knox was really healing from. Not just the trauma of war, but the trauma of being forced to destroy the part of himself that had found meaning in creating beauty. Knox, I'm so sorry. You didn't just lose your civilian life when you became a soldier. You had to actively destroy the work that defined who you were. Correct. And now I find that I cannot remember how to create, how to express, or how to connect with the artistic sensibilities that once provided purpose and identity. As Ivan worked to release 15 years of accumulated physical and emotional tension, he began to understand that Knox's healing wouldn't come from forgetting his military trauma, but from remembering who he had been before trauma taught him. That survival required the complete suppression of creative and emotional expression. Knox, what if we worked together to help your body remember what it felt like to be an artist? Not to replace your military experience, but to integrate it with the creative person you were before? For the first time in 18 months of sessions, Knox closed his eyes and allowed his body to completely relax under Ivan's care. I would like to try to remember. The following week, Knox arrived at the rehabilitation center, carrying something Ivan had never seen him bring to their sessions, a small, cloth-wrapped bundle that he handled with unusual care. Evan Petrov, Knox announced, his formal military tone softened by what sounded almost like nervousness. I have brought materials? Materials? Knox carefully unwrapped the bundle to reveal a piece of smooth stone about the size of a human fist, along with several basic carving tools that looked ancient and well used. These are the only artistic implements I was permitted to retain during military conscription. I have not touched them in 15 years, but after our previous session, I experienced impulses to create. Evan felt a surge of excitement mixed with concern. Knox's willingness to reconnect with his artistic identity represented significant progress, but Evan also knew that trauma recovery rarely proceeded in straight lines. That's incredible, Knox. What kind of impulses? Difficult to articulate. Physical sensations in my hands, visual concepts that emerge during sleep cycles, urges to shape materials into expressive forms. Knox's yellow eyes studied the stone with an intensity that Evan had never seen during their massage sessions. However, I have encountered an unexpected problem. What kind of problem? Knox positioned himself on the massage table, but instead of assuming his usual military precise posture, he held the stone and carving tools as if they were foreign objects whose purpose he'd forgotten. I remember the intellectual concepts of sculptural technique. I understand the theoretical principles of material manipulation and aesthetic composition, but my hands... Knox stared down at his massive, battle-scarred hands with an expression of profound frustration. My hands no longer remember how to create. They remember only how to destroy. Evan began working on Knox's shoulders, noting that the veteran's muscle tension had returned even more intensely than before. The prospect of reconnecting with his artistic identity was simultaneously healing and terrifying. Knox, that makes complete sense. Your hands have spent 15 years being trained for military purposes. It's natural that they would need time to remember different types of movement and intention. But the muscle memory should remain accessible, Knox protested. Morvakian physiology retains motor patterns indefinitely. I should be able to access sculptural techniques that I practiced for decades before military service. Even paused in his massage to examine Knox's hands more carefully. The veteran's fingers were thick and powerful, designed for a species that worked with heavy materials and required precise control for their high-gravity environment. But years of military conditioning had changed how he used them. "Knox, show me how you would hold a weapon." Without thinking, Knox's hands immediately configured into combat positions, thumbs positioned for trigger control, fingers arranged for rapid manipulation of military equipment, wrists angled for maximum force application. "Now show me how you would hold a sculpture tool." Knox stared at his hands for several seconds, his expression growing more frustrated, as his fingers remained locked in military positions. "Cannot. The motor pathways appear to have been overwritten by military conditioning." Avon had worked with many veterans whose bodies had been changed by military training, but Knox's situation was uniquely complex. His artistic identity hadn't just been suppressed, it had been systematically replaced with incompatible physical habits. "Knox, what if we approached this like physical rehabilitation? When soldiers recover from injuries, they have to relearn basic movements. Maybe you need to relearn artistic movements. Physical rehabilitation assumes that natural movement patterns can be restored through practice. But my natural movement patterns were deliberately eliminated and replaced with military conditioning." Avon continued working on Knox's shoulders while thinking through the implications of what the veteran was describing. Standard trauma therapy focused on processing emotional memories, but Knox's trauma was embedded in his physical neurology. "Knox, during your military training, did they specifically teach you to forget artistic techniques?" Morvakian military doctrine requires identity purification, a systematic elimination of civilian behavioral patterns that might compromise combat effectiveness. This included deliberate overriding of non-military motor skills. So they didn't just suppress your artistic identity, they actively erased your physical ability to create art? Correct. And now, I find that attempting to access sculptural techniques produces unexpected responses. What kind of responses? Knox's perfect military posture began to show signs of distress. His breathing became more controlled, his muscle tension increased, and his yellow eyes took on the hyper-alert focus that Avon recognized as signs of combat readiness activation. Attempting to use my hands for creative purposes triggers military threat assessment protocols. My neurological conditioning interprets artistic behavior as a security risk that must be eliminated. Avon stopped his massage entirely, realizing that Knox was describing a form of trauma that the Rehabilitation Center's standard therapies weren't equipped to address. "Knox, you're saying that your own military training is preventing your healing by treating your artistic identity as an enemy combatant?" Accurate assessment. My conditioning recognizes civilian behavioral patterns as incompatible with military efficiency and responds with suppression protocols. This explained why 18 months of advanced therapy had been ineffective for Knox. Every attempt to reconnect with his pre-military identity was being actively sabotaged by neurological conditioning that had been designed to make such reconnection impossible. Avon found himself facing a therapeutic challenge that was completely outside his training and experience. How do you help someone recover an identity that their own subconscious had been programmed to destroy? "Knox, I need to ask you something important. Do you want to recover your artistic abilities? Or do you want to find ways to be comfortable with who you've become as a soldier?" Knox was quiet for a long time, his massive form completely still as he processed a question that went to the heart of his identity crisis. "Ivan Petrov, for 15 years I have believed that military service required the permanent sacrifice of civilian identity. I accepted that becoming an effective soldier meant accepting the death of the artist I had been. And now? Now I find that the artist's death was ... incomplete. Parts of my creative identity survived military conditioning and are attempting to resurface. But the conditioning interprets this survival as a malfunction that must be corrected. Evan realized that Knox was describing an internal war between two incompatible versions of himself, the artist he had been and the soldier he had become. Neither identity was complete without the other, but his military conditioning made integration impossible. Knox, what if the problem isn't that you need to choose between being an artist or being a soldier? What if the problem is that you're military? Conditioning doesn't understand that you could be both. Morvakian military doctrine explicitly prohibits dual identity integration. Soldiers must maintain singular focus on combat effectiveness. But you're not an active soldier anymore. You're a veteran in recovery. Maybe the rules that applied during active service don't have to apply during the healing process. Knox's hands unconsciously moved toward the stone and carving tools he'd brought, then stopped as his conditioning triggered anxiety responses. Ivan, I must confess something. Yesterday, I attempted to create a small sculpture during my personal time. The experience was ... traumatic. What happened? As soon as I began making creative modifications to the stone, my conditioning activated combat stress responses. Elevated heart rate, hypervigilance, preparation for hostile engagement. My body interpreted artistic creation as a direct threat to military readiness. Avon understood the cruel irony of Knox's situation. The very conditioning that had made him an effective soldier was now preventing him from accessing the creative expression that could provide healing and meaning in civilian life. Knox, I want to try something that might seem completely unrelated to massage therapy. Specify methodology. I want to teach you how to use your hands for creation while maintaining your military conditioning, rather than trying to override or eliminate the conditioning. Explain theoretical basis. You said your conditioning interprets artistic behavior as a security risk. But what if we could demonstrate to your conditioning that artistic creation can actually enhance, rather than compromise your tactical capabilities? Knox's yellow eyes focused on Avon with intense interest. Continue. Military training teaches situational awareness, precise control, strategic thinking, and the ability to work effectively under pressure. Those are exactly the skills that advanced sculpture requires. You are suggesting that artistic creation could be reframed as applied military training? I'm suggesting that maybe your conditioning would accept artistic behavior if it understood that creativity and military effectiveness could work together rather than in opposition. For the first time since bringing his sculptural materials, Knox's breathing began to relax and his combat readiness posture softened slightly. Evan, your hypothesis suggests that identity integration might be possible through tactical recontextualization, rather than conditioning elimination. I think your military training and your artistic training were actually developing the same skills in different applications. Maybe you don't need to choose between them. Knox carefully picked up one of his carving tools, his massive hands trembling slightly as he fought against 15 years of conditioning that told him creative behavior was dangerous. I would like to attempt experimental integration methodology, but I will require guidance to prevent conditioning activation during artistic engagement. Even realized that their simple massage therapy sessions had evolved into something unprecedented, an attempt to heal a veteran's trauma by helping him integrate two incompatible identities rather than choosing between them. Knox, we're going to take this very slowly, but I think we might be able to help you remember that being an artist and being a soldier were never really contradictory. They were just different ways of serving your community. As Knox held his carving tools for the first time in 15 years, Evan saw something in the veteran's yellow eyes that had been completely absent during all their previous sessions. Hope. Over the following weeks, Evan's treatment room at the rehabilitation center became an unlikely combination of massage therapy, space, and art studio. Knox arrived for each session, carrying his small collection of sculptural materials, and their appointments evolved into collaborative explorations of how creative expression could coexist with military conditioning rather than threatening it. Today's objective, Knox announced during their 7th experimental session, is to attempt continuous sculptural engagement for 15 minutes without triggering combat readiness protocols. Even had learned to appreciate Knox's systematic approach to healing. The veteran treated recovery like a military mission, with specific objectives, measured progress, and detailed analysis of outcomes. But he'd also begun to display flashes of the artistic sensibility that had defined his pre-military identity. "Before we start the sculpture work, let me work on your shoulders," Even said, noting that Knox's muscle tension had become more complex over their recent sessions. "I'm noticing different patterns in your physical stress, not just military hypervigilance, but creative frustration." Knox positioned himself on the massage table, but instead of his previous rigid military posture, he now arranged himself in ways that allowed easier access to his sculptural materials. Accurate observation. My conditioning has begun to differentiate between threat-based creative behavior and tactically beneficial creative behavior. The discrimination is creating new forms of internal conflict. As Ivan worked on the chronic tension that had been locked in Knox's shoulders for years, he observed subtle changes in the veteran's physiology. The hyper-alert muscle patterns were still present, but they were now interwoven with different types of tension, the focused concentration that artists developed during creative work. "Knox, your body is trying to remember two different ways of being present in the world. Military awareness, which scans for external threats, and artistic awareness, which focuses on internal creative possibilities." Correct assessment. However, I have discovered that these two awareness modalities may not be incompatible as my conditioning assumed. Knox reached for his carving tools in stone while Ivan continued the massage, a multitasking capability that would have been impossible during their earlier sessions. Yesterday, I experienced a significant breakthrough in sculptural engagement. I was able to work on a small figure for 47 minutes without anxiety activation. That's amazing progress. What changed? I recontextualized the creative process using military planning methodology. Instead of approaching sculpture as emotional expression, I approached it as tactical problem-solving with aesthetic objectives. Knox began making small, precise cuts in his stone, while Ivan worked on releasing tension from his back muscles. The veteran's hands moved with increasing confidence as he applied military precision to artistic technique. I began by conducting reconnaissance on the raw material, analyzing its structural properties, identifying optimal approach vectors for modification, developing a strategic plan for achieving desired outcomes. Even watched Knox's face as he worked, noting how the veteran's expression showed both military focus and artistic satisfaction. "So you used your tactical training to support your creative work instead of fighting against it?" "Precisely. I discovered that successful sculpture requires many of the same capabilities that military operations require: advanced planning, precise execution, adaptability when encountering unexpected challenges, and sustained concentration under pressure." As Knox continued carving while receiving massage therapy, Even realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Knox wasn't choosing between his military identity and his artistic identity. He was integrating them into a unified approach to creative problem-solving. "Knox, show me what you're working on." The veteran held up his stone, which had been transformed into a small but remarkably detailed figure of a Morvakian in a contemplative pose. The sculpture showed technical mastery that suggested Knox's artistic skills had not been truly lost, just temporarily inaccessible. "This is a self-portrait reflecting my current psychological state. I am representing the integration of tactical awareness with creative exploration. Even studied the sculpture, amazed by the emotional depth that Knox had been able to express through his recontextualized artistic process. Knox, this is beautiful. And it's completely different from the memorial installations you described from your civilian career. Correct observation. My artistic style has evolved to incorporate perspectives and techniques that I developed through military experience. I am no longer the same artist I was before military service, but I am also no longer limited to purely military applications of my capabilities. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Sage Harmony, the Rehabilitation Center's chief therapist, who entered the treatment room with the expression administrators wore when they discovered unauthorized activities. Mr. Petrov, I have received reports that you are conducting unregistered therapeutic activities with veteran Knox. Can you explain why your treatment room contains sculptural materials and why your massage sessions extend beyond scheduled time parameters? Even felt his stomach drop. In his focus on helping Knox integrate his artistic and military identities, he had apparently violated rehabilitation center protocols without realizing it. Dr. Harmony, Knox and I have been exploring creative expression as a complementary approach to traditional massage therapy. We've documented significant improvements in his trauma recovery through integrated artistic engagement. Mr. Petrov, you are qualified to provide massage therapy, not art therapy or experimental psychological intervention. Veteran Knox's treatment plan requires adherence to established therapeutic protocols. Knox carefully set down his carving tools and addressed Dr. Harmony with the formal military bearing he used for interactions with authority figures. Dr. Sage Harmony, respectfully, the experimental integration methodology has produced measurable improvements in my psychological and physical condition that 18 months of standard therapy did not achieve. Veteran Knox, while I appreciate your positive response to Mr. Petrov's enthusiasm, effective trauma treatment requires professional oversight and evidence-based approaches. Unauthorized therapeutic experimentation could potentially compromise your recovery progress. Even watched Knox's expression shift as he processed Dr. Harmony's implicit criticism of their collaborative work. The veteran's shoulders resumed their military tension, and his hands moved away from his sculptural materials. Dr. Harmony, Ivan interjected, I understand your concerns about protocol compliance, but Knox has made breakthrough progress in reconnecting with pre-trauma identity elements. Isn't that a positive therapeutic outcome regardless of methodology? Mr. Petrov, positive outcomes must be achieved through appropriate professional channels. I cannot authorize massage therapists to conduct experimental psychological interventions, regardless of apparent results. Knox stood up from the massage table and began packing his sculptural materials with the mechanical efficiency that even recognized as the veteran's response to institutional rejection. Knox, wait, even said. Dr. Harmony, what would it take to get our approach officially recognized? If Knox is showing measurable improvement, shouldn't we explore ways to continue what's working? Mr. Petrov, if you believe this approach has therapeutic value, you would need to document your methodology, submit it for professional review, obtain appropriate certifications, and conduct supervised trials under registered art therapy protocols. How long would that process take? Assuming favorable reviews and available resources, approximately 18 to 24 months. Even looked at Knox, who had resumed his perfect military posture and was staring at nothing with the emotional disconnection that had characterized their first 42 sessions together. Dr. Harmony, Knox has spent 18 months making no progress under standard protocols, and he's made significant breakthrough progress in 4 weeks of collaborative work. Does institutional protocol matter more than veteran recovery? Mr. Petrov, institutional protocols exist to ensure veteran safety and therapeutic effectiveness. Individual success stories do not justify abandoning established treatment standards. Knox finished packing his materials and stood at attention with a formal bearing. That signaled he was preparing to disengage from the situation entirely. Doctor. Sage Harmony, I will comply with standard therapeutic protocols and discontinue experimental integration activities. Thank you for maintaining appropriate professional oversight. Knox, no, Evan said, recognizing that the veteran was retreating into military compliance to avoid conflict with authority figures. You've made too much progress to give up now. Ivan Petrov, therapeutic compliance is required for continued rehabilitation center access. I cannot compromise my treatment eligibility for unauthorized experimental activities. Dr. Harmony began documenting the session termination on her administrative tablet, but Ivan realized he had to make a decision that could either help Knox continue his healing or end both their careers at the rehabilitation center. Dr. Harmony, what if Knox and I continued our work outside the rehabilitation center, as friends rather than therapist and patient? Mr. Petrov, I cannot prevent your personal relationships with veterans, but I must advise you that continuing therapeutic activities without proper oversight could create liability issues for both you and veteran Knox. Knox looked at Ivan with an expression that combined military discipline with barely suppressed hope. Ivan, you would be willing to risk professional complications to continue collaborative work on personal time? Knox, you've spent 15 years believing that healing required choosing between your military identity and your artistic identity. In 4 weeks, we've proven that integration is possible. I'm not going to let institutional protocols prevent you from recovering both parts of yourself. Dr. Harmony completed her documentation and headed toward the door, pausing to deliver a final administrative warning. Mr. Petrov, I respect your dedication to veteran care, but please remember that good intentions do not eliminate professional responsibilities. Proceed with appropriate caution. After Dr. Harmony left, Knox remained standing at attention, processing the implications of what Ivan had offered. Ivan, you would potentially compromise your career advancement to continue experimental therapy with a single veteran. Knox, you've taught me that the most important healing happens when people are willing to integrate different parts of themselves rather than choosing between them. Maybe it's time I integrated my professional responsibilities with my personal values. Knox relaxed his military posture slightly, his yellow eyes showing the vulnerability that Ivan had learned to recognize as signs of genuine emotional engagement. I would be honored to continue collaborative work as friends rather than therapist and patient. As they began planning how to continue Knox's healing outside the constraints of institutional protocols, Evan realized that their therapeutic relationship had evolved into something much more meaningful than professional service provision. They had become partners in exploring what recovery could look like, when it honored all parts of a person's identity, rather than requiring them to choose between incompatible versions of themselves. Sometimes, the most important healing happened when people were willing to prioritize individual needs over institutional requirements. 3 weeks after their official sessions ended, Evan discovered that helping Knox heal outside the rehabilitation center's constraints was both more rewarding and more challenging than anything he'd experienced in his professional career. They met twice weekly in Ivan's apartment, where the living room had been converted into an improvised therapy space that combined massage equipment with an expanding collection of Knox's sculptural works. Progress report, Knox announced during their Tuesday evening session, displaying a discipline and formality that had softened but never disappeared even in their personal friendship. I have successfully completed 3 sculptural works without triggering combat stress responses. However, I have encountered a new challenge. Evan looked at Knox's latest creations, which had evolved from simple self-portraits to complex abstract pieces that seemed to represent the internal landscape of trauma recovery. The veteran's artistic skills were returning with remarkable speed, but his work carried an emotional intensity that suggested deeper healing was creating new forms of vulnerability. What kind of challenge? Knox positioned himself for massage, while carefully arranging his carving tools within easy reach a routine they'd developed that allowed him to work on sculpture, while receiving the physical therapy that helped his body remember how to relax. I am beginning to experience emotional responses to my artistic work. Not just satisfaction from technical achievement, but complex feelings about the subject matter I am choosing to represent. Even began working on Knox's shoulders, noting that the veteran's muscle tension patterns had changed dramatically over their weeks of collaboration. The chronic hypervigilance was still present, but it was now balanced by the focused relaxation that came from sustained creative engagement. That sounds like a positive development. What kind of emotional responses? Knox picked up his current sculpture, a piece that appeared to represent multiple figures in various poses of distress, support, and transformation. His massive hands worked with increasing precision as he shaped details that seemed to emerge from some internal vision. Grief, Knox said quietly. I am creating memorial installations for the parts of myself that were lost during military conditioning. And also hope for integration possibilities that I had believed were impossible. Even understood that Knox was processing 15 years of suppressed mourning for his civilian identity, while simultaneously rediscovering creative capabilities he'd thought were permanently destroyed. Knox, that sounds incredibly difficult, but also incredibly important. Agreed. However, the emotional processing is creating unexpected complications in my daily functioning. Knox's carving became more intense as he worked on details that seemed to represent internal struggle and resolution. His breathing remained steady, but Ivan could feel the emotional tension that was now flowing through his creative work rather than being locked in his muscles. Yesterday, I encountered another veteran at the market Velthar, a Rigelian who served in the same conflict sector. He approached me for routine military camaraderie, but I found myself unable to engage in standard veteran interaction protocols. What do you mean? Instead of exchanging combat statistics and tactical reminiscences, I wanted to discuss artistic techniques and creative expression. Velthar interpreted this as evidence of psychological instability. Even realized that Knox's healing was creating social complications he hadn't anticipated. Veterans often maintained connections through shared military experiences, but Knox's identity integration was making those traditional connections feel inadequate or inauthentic. How did that make you feel? Isolated? I am no longer fully comfortable in military veteran social contexts, but I have no access to civilian artistic communities. I exist in an identity space that neither group recognizes as valid. Knox's sculpture work intensified as he processed these feelings, his hands creating forms that seemed to represent the loneliness of existing between incompatible social categories. Knox, maybe the problem isn't that you don't fit in existing communities. Maybe you're developing a new kind of identity that could help other veterans who are struggling with similar integration challenges. Explain methodology. Even continued the massage while thinking through the implications of what Knox was experiencing. How many other veterans at the rehabilitation center are struggling because they can't access the parts of themselves that existed before military service? Based on informal observation, approximately 60 to 70% of veterans in the program appear to be managing identity conflicts related to civilian military integration. And how many of them have access to therapeutic approaches that help them recover pre-military identity elements rather than just managing post-military trauma? Knox paused in his sculpting to consider Ivan's question. Standard rehabilitation protocols focus on functional adaptation to civilian life rather than recovery of pre-military identity components. So most veterans are being taught to manage Their trauma rather than heal the identity fragmentation that creates the trauma. Accurate assessment. I had not previously considered the systemic implications of my individual healing experience. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. At Evan's apartment door. Through the window, they could see Dr. Sage Harmony from the Rehabilitation Center, accompanied by two other figures whose professional bearing suggested official business. Ivan Petrov, Dr. Harmony announced when he opened the door. This is Dr. Marcus Stormwind from the Galactic Veterans Affairs Authority and Dr. Lyra Brightwater from the Professional Therapy Standards Board. We need to discuss your ongoing activities with veteran Knox. Avon felt his heart sink as he realized their private therapeutic collaboration had attracted official scrutiny. Knox immediately stood at military attention, his artistic materials forgotten as his conditioning activated in response to authority. Figures. Dr. Harmony, Knox and I have been meeting as friends to continue work that was producing positive results. We're not violating any professional protocols. Mr. Petrov, Dr. Stormwind interjected. We have received reports that you are conducting unlicensed therapeutic interventions with a traumatized veteran, potentially creating liability risks for multiple institutions. Dr. Stormwind, Knox has made remarkable progress in recovering pre-trauma identity elements that 18 months of standard therapy couldn't access. Isn't veteran recovery more important than regulatory compliance? Dr. Brightwater consulted her professional standards. Documentation with the expression of someone whose primary concern was institutional protection rather than individual healing outcomes. Mr. Petrov, regardless of apparent positive results, unauthorized therapy violates professional standards that exist to protect both practitioners and clients from unregulated treatment risks. Knox stepped forward, his military bearing commanding attention from all the officials present. Dr. Stormwind, Dr. Brightwater, respectfully, I request permission to address these concerns directly. Proceed, veteran Knox. Knox's voice took on the formal clarity he used for military briefings, but his content reflected the integrated identity he'd been developing through his work with Ivan. For 18 months, I received standard rehabilitation therapy that addressed symptom management, but failed to restore functional identity integration. In 4 weeks of collaborative work with Ivan Petrov, I have recovered artistic capabilities that had been suppressed for 15 years and developed coping strategies that allow coexistence of military and civilian identity elements. Knox gestured to his sculptural works, which were arranged throughout Evan's living room like a gallery exhibition of trauma recovery. These installations represent documented progress in emotional processing, creative expression, and psychological integration that traditional therapy protocols did not achieve. I formally request that this collaborative methodology be evaluated based on therapeutic outcomes rather than regulatory compliance. Dr. Harmony examined Knox's sculptures with growing surprise, clearly not having expected to find sophisticated artistic works in what she'd assumed was amateur therapy experimentation. Veteran Knox, these pieces demonstrate remarkable technical skill and emotional depth. When did you develop these artistic capabilities? I am a trained sculptor with 23 years of pre-military artistic experience. Standard rehabilitation protocols did not address identity recovery, only trauma management. Dr. Stormwind was also studying Knox's work with professional interest. Veteran Knox, are you saying that your primary therapeutic need was artistic identity restoration rather than combat trauma processing? Correct assessment. My trauma was not just from combat experiences, but from forced elimination of civilian identity during military conditioning. Healing required integration of military and artistic capabilities, not suppression of one in favor of the other. Even watched the officials process Knox's explanation, seeing their administrative assumptions about veteran therapy being challenged by direct evidence of alternative approaches. Dr. Stormwind even said, "What if Knox's experience suggests that many veterans need identity integration therapy rather than just trauma management? What if we're treating symptoms instead of addressing root causes?" Dr. Brightwater was documenting Knox's sculptures with obvious fascination, despite her professional concerns about regulatory violations. "Mr. Petrov, even if your methodology shows positive results with this specific veteran, that doesn't justify abandoning professional oversight and standards compliance. But it does suggest that professional standards might need to evolve to accommodate approaches that actually work for complex trauma cases." Avon replied. Knox moved to his latest sculpture, the memorial installation he'd been working on during their session, and continued carving while addressing the assembled officials. "Dr. Brightwater, may I demonstrate the therapeutic integration methodology that Ivan Petrov developed?" "Proceed." Knox began working on his sculpture while describing his process. "Ivan applies massage therapy to release physical trauma patterns, while I engage in artistic creation that processes emotional trauma content. The combination allows simultaneous healing of body and identity rather than sequential treatment of isolated symptoms." As Knox worked, his entire demeanor displayed the calm focus that Ivan had learned to recognize as evidence of successful therapeutic integration. The veteran was simultaneously accessing military precision, artistic creativity, and emotional processing capabilities that standard therapy had treated as incompatible. "Fascinating," Dr. Stormwind murmured. "Veteran Knox, you appear to be demonstrating multifaceted functionality that our rehabilitation assessments indicated was impossible for your trauma profile." Dr. Stormwind, standard assessments were based on the assumption that military conditioning and civilian identity were mutually exclusive. Ivan Petrov's approach demonstrated that integration was possible through collaborative rather than replacement methodology. Dr. Harmony was taking detailed notes about Knox's therapeutic demonstration. "Mr. Petrov, how did you develop this integrated approach? It's not covered in any massage therapy training I'm familiar with." Avon realized that the official's interest in Knox's progress was creating an opportunity to advocate for therapeutic innovation rather than just defending their unauthorized collaboration. "Dr. Harmony, I developed it by listening to what Knox actually needed rather than following protocols designed for different types of trauma. He needed to recover his artistic identity, not just manage his military trauma." "And the massage therapy component?" Knox's artistic identity was locked in his physical muscle memory. Traditional talk therapy couldn't access motor pattern trauma, but massage therapy, combined with creative expression, could help his body remember how to create instead of just how to defend. Dr. Brightwater was reviewing her professional standards. Documentation with growing confusion. "Mr. Petrov, your approach appears to combine elements from multiple therapeutic disciplines in ways that aren't recognized by current certification requirements." Dr. Brightwater, maybe that's because current certification requirements assume that different types of healing should be kept separate instead of integrated. Knox finished a section of his sculpture and set down his carving tools to address the officials directly. "Dr. Brightwater, I formally request that you consider Ivan Petrov's methodology for inclusion in veteran rehabilitation protocols. If this approach can help other veterans recover suppressed identity elements, it could significantly improve rehabilitation success rates." Dr. Stormwind was studying Knox's completed sculptures with the expression of someone who's professional. Assumptions were being challenged by undeniable evidence. "Veteran Knox, how many other veterans in the rehabilitation program might benefit from identity integration therapy rather than standard trauma management?" Based on informal conversation with fellow veterans, I estimate that 60 to 70% are struggling with issues related to civilian identity recovery rather than just combat trauma processing. The room fell quiet as the implications of Knox's assessment became apparent. If most veterans were struggling with identity integration rather than just trauma management, then the rehabilitation system's entire therapeutic approach might be addressing symptoms while ignoring root causes. Dr. Stormwind even said, "What would it take to get this approach officially evaluated? If Knox's experience could help other veterans, shouldn't that be worth exploring regardless of current regulatory limitations?" Dr. Stormwind exchanged glances with his colleagues, clearly processing a decision that could either advance veteran care or create bureaucratic complications. "Mr. Petrov, if you're willing to document your methodology and submit to supervised evaluation, we might be able to establish a pilot program for identity integration therapy." "What kind of evaluation?" "Formal case study documentation, peer review by certified therapists, controlled trials with volunteer veterans, and development of training protocols that could be implemented at other rehabilitation facilities." Knox's posture straightened with the enthusiasm Ivan had learned to associate with his most engaged and hopeful moments. "Dr. Stormwind, I volunteer as a case study subject and advocate for expanded identity integration therapy research." Ivan looked around his living room, which had accidentally become the demonstration site for potentially revolutionary changes in veteran rehabilitation methodology. "Dr. Stormwind, I accept your evaluation proposal, but I want to make sure that whatever system we develop prioritizes veteran recovery over regulatory compliance." "Mr. Petrov, the best regulatory compliance serves veteran recovery. Perhaps our current standards need to evolve to better serve both objectives." As the officials began planning formal evaluation of Ivan and Knox's collaborative approach, Ivan realized that their simple friendship had evolved into something with implications far beyond individual healing. They had accidentally discovered that the most effective therapy emerged from treating people as complex, integrated beings rather than collections of isolated problems that could be fixed through standardized protocols. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs happened when people were willing to prioritize individual needs over institutional convenience. 6 months after their first experimental session, Ivan found himself standing before the Galactic Veterans Rehabilitation Council, presenting research that had transformed from unauthorized friendship into officially recognized therapeutic innovation. The Identity Integration Protocol, Ivan explained to the assembled rehabilitation directors, medical professionals, and veteran advocates, is based on a simple premise. Healing trauma requires recovering the full person, not just managing the damaged parts. The council chamber was filled with officials from 43 different worlds, all seeking to understand how a massage therapist and a combat veteran had developed therapeutic methods that were showing unprecedented success. Rates in veteran rehabilitation programs. Traditional trauma therapy focuses on processing combat experiences and managing post-military adjustment challenges. Ivan continued, but for many veterans, the primary trauma isn't what happened during military service. It's the loss of who they were before military service. Knox sat in the front row, his sculptures displayed throughout the chamber as evidence of what identity integration could achieve. The veteran had volunteered to serve as both case study subject and advocate for the therapeutic approach that had transformed his recovery. The breakthrough insight came from recognizing that military conditioning often requires the systematic suppression or elimination of civilian identity elements that could provide meaning, purpose, and emotional stability during the transition back to civilian life. Ivan clicked to his next presentation slide, showing before and after assessments of Knox's psychological, physical, and creative functioning over their months of collaboration. Knox's case demonstrates that recovery isn't just about processing trauma. It's about recovering the capabilities and identity elements that trauma forced into suppression. Council Director Magnus Stormwright, a Rigelian administrator whose tentacles conveyed professional skepticism, consulted his documentation with obvious concern. Mr. Petrov, while veteran Knox's individual progress is impressive, how do you propose to standardize an approach that appears to be based on highly individualized artistic expression? Director Stormwright, the standardizable element isn't the specific creative medium, it's the integration methodology. We've developed protocols that can help veterans reconnect with whatever civilian identity elements were suppressed during their military conditioning. Evan gestured to Knox, who stood to address the council with the confident bearing of someone who had learned to integrate his military training with his artistic sensibilities. Council members, may I demonstrate the practical applications of identity integration therapy? Proceed, veteran Knox. Knox moved to a workstation that had been set up for his presentation, containing sculptural materials that he handled with the same precision he'd once applied to military equipment. Before therapy with Ivan Petrov, I believed that effective. Military service required the permanent elimination of civilian capabilities. I spent 15 years managing the psychological consequences of identity fragmentation. Knox began working on a sculpture while he spoke, his hands demonstrating the integrated functionality that had emerged through their collaborative healing process. Identity integration protocol taught me that military training and artistic training develop complementary rather than contradictory capabilities. Strategic thinking, precise execution, sustained concentration, and adaptability under pressure are essential for both effective combat and sophisticated creative expression. As Knox worked, his entire presentation style displayed the calm confidence that Ethan had learned to recognize as evidence of successful therapeutic integration. The healing breakthrough occurred when I learned to apply military discipline to artistic creation and artistic sensitivity to military problem-solving. Integration, rather than replacement of identity elements. Council member Dr. Lyra Brightwater, who had initially opposed their unauthorized therapeutic experimentation, was taking detailed notes about Knox's demonstration. Veteran Knox, how do you respond to concerns that identity integration therapy might compromise the military conditioning that enables veterans to function effectively in crisis situations? Knox paused in his sculptural work to address this question directly. Dr. Brightwater, my military conditioning has been enhanced rather than compromised by identity integration. Artistic training has improved my tactical creativity, strategic visualization, and stress management capabilities. Can you provide specific examples? Yesterday, I assisted with emergency response coordination when a transport accident occurred near the rehabilitation center. I was able to apply both military crisis management protocols and artistic spatial reasoning to develop evacuation strategies that other responders had not considered. Knox returned to his sculpture, which had taken the form of multiple figures, supporting each other through various challenges, a memorial installation representing the community support that had enabled his healing. Integration therapy has made me more effective in both military and civilian contexts, not less effective in either. Even watched the council members process Knox's demonstration with growing interest. The veterans' confidence and functionality were providing compelling evidence that identity integration could enhance rather than compromise veteran capabilities. Council members even said, "We've documented similar results with 17 other veterans who have participated in identity integration therapy over the past 6 months. Recovery rates have improved by an average of 73% compared to standard rehabilitation protocols." Director Stormwright was reviewing the statistical data with obvious surprise. Mr. Petrov, these results suggest that identity integration therapy is significantly more effective than current standard approaches. How do you explain such dramatic improvements? Director Stormwright, we're treating the actual cause of veteran adjustment difficulties rather than just managing the symptoms. Most veterans struggle with civilian transition because they've lost access to the identity elements that provided meaning and purpose before their military service. Council member Dr. Aurora Tidewaker, a Zephyrian rehabilitation specialist whose translucent features indicated intense professional interest, addressed both Ivan and Knox directly. Mr. Petrov, veteran Knox, your approach appears to contradict fundamental assumptions about the relationship between military conditioning and civilian identity. How do you propose to train other therapists in methodology that challenges established therapeutic theory? Knox finished his sculpture and displayed it for the assembled council, a complex installation that seemed to represent the integration of multiple identity elements into a unified, functional whole. Dr. Tidewaker, the training methodology focuses on helping therapists recognize and support clients' existing integration capabilities rather than teaching new therapeutic techniques. Explain your reasoning, veteran Knox. Most veterans already possess the skills necessary for identity integration. They develop them during their pre-military civilian lives. Therapy needs to help them remember and adapt these capabilities, rather than teaching them completely new approaches to civilian functioning. Ivan moved to stand beside Knox, their partnership representing the collaborative approach that had made identity integration therapy possible. Dr. Tidewaker, we train therapists to ask different questions. Instead of, how can we help you manage your military trauma? We ask, who were you before military service? And how can we help you recover those capabilities in ways that work with, rather than against your military experience? The council chamber fell quiet as the assembled officials processed the implications of what Evan and Knox were proposing, a fundamental reconceptualization of veteran rehabilitation that treated military and civilian identity as potentially complementary rather than inherently conflicting. Director Stormwright consulted with his colleagues before addressing Ivan and Knox directly. Mr. Petrov, veteran Knox, the Council is prepared to authorize expansion of identity integration protocol to all rehabilitation centers in this sector. However, we need standardized training materials and assessment tools that can ensure consistent implementation across multiple facilities and species. Knox's sculpture work had attracted a small crowd of council members who were examining his artistic technique while discussing the therapeutic principles it represented. Director Stormwright, veteran Knox and I have developed training protocols that can be adapted for different species' physiologies and cultural backgrounds. The core methodology is universal, help people recover and integrate all parts of their identity rather than forcing them to choose between incompatible versions of themselves. And the assessment tools? Even pulled out documentation that he and Knox had compiled over months of working with multiple veterans. We measure progress based on functional integration rather than symptom reduction. Veterans demonstrate recovery by successfully accessing both military and civilian capabilities, not by suppressing military conditioning. As the council session concluded with formal authorization for galactic implementation of identity integration protocol, Evan realized that their simple friendship had accidentally revolutionized how entire civilizations approached trauma recovery and veteran rehabilitation. Knox, he said as they packed up their presentation materials, when you first came to the rehabilitation center, were you hoping for anything like this? Knox's yellow eyes showed the contentment that Evan had learned to recognize as evidence of deep satisfaction with meaningful work. Even when I first approached you for massage therapy, I was hoping to manage chronic muscle tension so I could maintain basic functionality. I never imagined that healing could mean recovering capabilities I thought were permanently lost. And now I understand that the most important healing happens when people help each other remember who they really are, rather than who they think they have to become. As they walked through the rehabilitation center that had become the model for veteran care throughout the galaxy, Evan reflected on how their collaborative approach had demonstrated something profound about the relationship between individual healing, and community support. Sometimes, the most revolutionary therapy emerged from the simplest insight that people recover best when they're helped to integrate all parts of themselves, rather than being forced to choose between different versions of who they could be. The massage therapy had just been the beginning. The real healing had come from friendship, mutual respect, and the willingness to believe that everyone contained more possibilities than their current circumstances suggested. 2 years after Knox first brought his sculptural tools to Evans' massage therapy sessions, the Galactic Veterans Rehabilitation Center had become the most successful trauma recovery facility in known space, with veterans traveling from dozens of worlds to participate in identity integration protocol programs. The waiting list for our services now extends to 14 months. Even told the assembled delegates at the Interstellar Mental Health Summit, addressing an audience that included medical directors, government officials, and veteran advocates from across the galaxy. What began as an unauthorized friendship between a massage therapist and a combat veteran has evolved into therapeutic methodology that's being implemented in over 200 facilities throughout 43 star systems. Even click to his presentation slide showing statistical outcomes from 2 years of identity integration protocol implementation recovery rates that exceeded traditional trauma therapy by an average of 78%, with sustained improvement lasting significantly longer than standard treatment approaches. But the most important discovery wasn't about therapeutic techniques or treatment protocols. The most important discovery was that trauma recovery requires community support for integration rather than individual effort to overcome fragmentation. In the audience, Knox watched his former massage therapist with the satisfaction of someone whose healing had contributed to healing for thousands of others. The veteran had become the galaxy's leading advocate for identity integration therapy, traveling to rehabilitation centers throughout known space to train therapists and support veteran communities. Knox's sculptures were now displayed in museums and memorial installations throughout the galaxy, but his most meaningful work remained the training programs that helped other veterans remember that military service and civilian identity could coexist rather than compete. Dr. Ivan Petrov, announced Supreme Medical Coordinator Aurora Lightweaver from the Galactic Health Authority, on behalf of medical professionals throughout known space, we want to express our gratitude for your contributions to what historians are calling the third renaissance of trauma recovery. Ivan smiled at the formal recognition, but his real satisfaction came from the letters he received weekly from veterans who had used identity integration protocol to recover capabilities they'd thought were permanently lost to military conditioning. Coordinator Lightweaver, the most important outcome isn't the advanced therapeutic applications. It's the demonstration that recovery happens fastest when people help each other integrate different parts of their identity rather than forcing them to choose between incompatible versions of themselves. After the presentation, Ivan was approached by researchers, medical directors, and policymakers who wanted to understand how to apply identity integration methodology to trauma recovery challenges beyond veteran rehabilitation. But the conversation that mattered most came from Knox himself, who had transformed from an emotionally disconnected combat veteran into a thoughtful advocate, whose work focused on helping other veterans discover that healing meant recovering all of who they were, rather than just managing who they had become. Ivan, Knox said, as they walked through the expanded rehabilitation center that now served as a model for therapeutic communities throughout the galaxy. I have been reflecting on our collaboration, and I realize that you taught me something more valuable than identity integration. What's that? You taught me that healing happens through relationships based on mutual respect and genuine curiosity about each person's complete identity, rather than through professional interventions designed to fix isolated problems. They paused beside the memorial garden Knox had created to honor veterans who had died before accessing identity integration therapy a space that combined military precision with artistic beauty in ways that represented the integration possibilities available to all trauma survivors. Knox, you taught me that professional expertise means helping people recover their own capabilities rather than replacing their limitations with therapeutic techniques. The most effective therapy helps people remember what they already know about being whole. And that applies beyond veteran rehabilitation? Their conversation was interrupted by a group of young therapists from the Interspecies Training Academy, who approached with the enthusiasm, even had learned to associate with people who were discovering that healing work was more creative and collaborative than they'd expected. Dr. Petrov, veteran Knox, called out Zara, a recent graduate whose multicultural training reflected the integrated approach that had emerged from their collaborative methodology. We've been working on identity integration applications for refugee trauma recovery, and we think we figured out how to adapt your protocols for displacement trauma rather than military conditioning trauma. Even felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from watching young professionals discover that therapeutic innovation emerged from understanding what people actually needed rather than following established protocols for what they were supposed to need. That's fantastic, Zara. What made you think of applying identity integration to refugee recovery? Well, you always say that trauma recovery requires helping people integrate all parts of their identity rather than forcing them to choose between their past and their present. Refugees face similar challenges to veterans. They've lost access to identity elements that provided meaning and community, and standard therapy focuses on adaptation to new circumstances rather than integration of their complete cultural identity. Knox's expression showed the appreciation Ivan recognized as deep satisfaction with educational success that extended their collaborative insights to new populations and challenges. Zara, you have identified integration applications that neither even nor I had considered. That represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking that advances therapeutic understanding beyond our individual discoveries. As the students continued describing their research project with the enthusiasm of young professionals who had learned that their cultural knowledge was valuable to advanced therapeutic practice, even realized that their most lasting impact wouldn't be measured in individual recoveries or institutional changes. Their most lasting impact would be the generation of therapists who had learned that everyone's identity was complex and valuable, that the most effective healing emerged from helping people integrate different parts of themselves, and that therapy was something people did together rather than something professionals did to clients. Avon, Knox said as they concluded their conversation with the students, I want to tell you something I have never said to a therapeutic collaborator. What's that? Thank you. Not for the professional recognition or the therapeutic breakthroughs, but for believing that I contained possibilities beyond my trauma symptoms and military conditioning. Even looked around the rehabilitation center, where veterans from dozens of species were engaged in identity integration activities that combined therapeutic healing with creative expression, community building, and mutual support. Knox, I think, we discovered something more important than identity integration therapy or veteran rehabilitation protocols. What did we discover? We discovered that when people approach each other's trauma with genuine curiosity about their complete identity, rather than just professional concern about their presenting problems, healing becomes possible in ways that surprise everyone involved. You mean that therapeutic relationships are more powerful than therapeutic techniques. I mean that therapeutic relationships are therapeutic techniques, and the most effective interventions emerge from caring about people's wholeness rather than just their functionality. 3 years after their first experimental massage and sculpture session, even Petrov and Knox had become symbols of what the galaxy's mental health community called integrated healing, the recognition that trauma recovery required community support for identity integration rather than individual effort to overcome specific symptoms. But more importantly, They had remained friends who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who continued to learn from each other's perspectives, and who had discovered that the most meaningful work was always collaborative work that honored everyone's complete identity, sometimes changing how entire civilizations approached trauma recovery was less about developing new therapeutic techniques and more about rediscovering ancient wisdom, that healing happened fastest when people helped each other remember who they really were instead of trying to fix who they had become. The identity integration was just the method. A friendship was the foundation